right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this particular event. This is the Breakout Room, and I'm going to be talking to you about cultural intelligence. Now, I am aware, just from the picture, that it might be a bit hazy and I might jump around a bit. We've been trying to sort out my reception, so if that's the case, I'm really sorry, but I hope you can hear me, and that's the important thing. Right, so my name's Jennifer Izekor, and I'm really excited to be presenting to you today. We're going to be talking about cultural intelligence and how that helps you communicate, not just inclusively, but also intuitively. Now, you may or may not you may or may not have heard about cultural intelligence before, but I hope by the end of this session, what you will have is a kind of insight into something that I think is incredibly exciting. Um, Now, for many people, cultural intelligence will, you'll often think about cultural competency, cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity. And I hope that what I'm going to do today is help you to understand what the difference is and that you take away some of that theory and it will really help you think about how you communicate and what that means for you. So, I'm going to start off telling you a little bit about myself. I am the executive director of Above Difference Limited. And Above Difference has been a while. If I can have the next slide, please. Above Difference has been around for a while now. We've been around for about 2 years. We're the leading provider of cultural intelligence training, development, and consultancy services across the UK public sector. And I'll tell you why the UK public sector in a minute, because when I set it up, I was quite clear in my mind that I wanted to introduce cultural intelligence into the public sector because I was that excited about it. Um, Now, we're also the UK-based strategic partner, and actually the only one at the moment, of the Cultural Intelligence Centre, who actually own the trademark on cultural intelligence, and that's their logo over there. They're based in Michigan, USA, have been around for about 20 odd years, and actually have done a lot of the research. It's still led by a lot of the people who did the initial research on cultural intelligence. And we're licensed by the Cultural Intelligence Centre to offer the full suite of cultural intelligence products. So we work with a lot of organizations across the public sector in the UK, introducing cultural intelligence as a new way of thinking about inclusion and diversity from a whole range of perspectives. Now, if I can have the next slide, please. I've already told you a bit about me. I'm the chief executive, the founder. I think what's relevant to this particular event, though, is that before I set up Above Difference, I had worked in the public sector for about 20 plus years. My last few roles, in quite senior roles actually, I'd worked as a public appointee, as a commissioner with the Independent Police Complaints Commission, as it then was. Prior to that, I was actually a senior civil servant briefly. And I worked in what was then the government office as one of the directors for children and learners and part of what was then the DCSF. I'm also an advanced accredited cultural intelligence trainer and facilitator. And I kind of stumbled upon cultural intelligence in my last role, having gotten a bit bored with unconscious bias and all the other things that were out there that didn't seem to offer solutions and didn't seem to really give us an explanation about how we could do things better. And I literally was doing a sort of Wikipedia search and stumbled on cultural intelligence and became passionate about it and have ever since. I'm also a leadership coach, trainer, and speaker. So for me, there are two elements to what I do. One is about cultural intelligence, which covers inclusion and diversity and all those things, but also leadership. And I'm a firm believer in the power of leaders to create culture, to shape culture, to create those inclusive working environments for everyone. But also, my own leadership journey has challenged me in terms of what that means in the way I lead. I'm, really blessed to have an organization that's steadily growing and have people on board. And daily, I'm challenged by how cultural intelligence helps me be a better leader. And I hope that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. If I can have the next slide, please. So what do we do? I'm going to kind of race through this, but I think this is also quite relevant. We're all about difference, and so in most of the stuff we put out, we don't often just talk about diversity and inclusion, but we talk about difference, and we talk about equipping organizations, leaders, communities to do difference differently, and that means thinking about the way people see difference, about the way they lead difference, how they experience it, and I think for those of you listening, that's quite important because it's not just about thinking about the lived experience of other people when it comes to difference, but also about our own lived experience. And I hope some of the stuff I'm going to talk to you about today will help you think about that, because difference is it's everywhere. We're all different in some way. And if there's one thing that I personally want to move away from, is those little boxes that we've created with which we sort of identify ourselves. And those boxes I don't think are particularly helpful, because they never reflect the full complexity of our humanity. And so difference for me is really important. And that's what we really talk about, how people engage with it and how they value it. So let's move on to the next slide. So what I'm going to do today is, over the next 30 odd minutes, I think, which is what we've got now, I'm going to talk to you, as I said, talk to you about cultural intelligence. What is it? Why is it important? And what does it mean for you personally in your journey as a leader? And what does it mean for the people that you lead? Now, I have to say, when we do cultural intelligence with organizations, it's a full day masterclass. And actually, that's just part of it. Then we're looking at coaching and working with people. So there's a limit to what I'm going to be able to cover in 30 odd minutes. But what I am going to do, as I said, is introduce you to it. Then we're going to look at culture briefly. And I'm hoping that when I do that, I'm actually going to get you involved in it. So I'm going to be asking you to use the chat function and actually respond to me on a question that I'm going to ask you. And then I'm going to take you through just a taste of what cultural value dimensions are, and particularly look at two: power distance and individualism and collectivism, and introduce you to that and help you to think about what that might mean for you in your journey as a leader. And hopefully at the end of that, we'll bring it to the end, and we'll put our details up. If you get fascinated by this, most people who sort of stumble upon cultural intelligence become a bit passionate about it, like I am. So do get in touch with us if you want some more details about it. Okay, so I'm going to start off, instead of going into a very long history about where cultural intelligence originated from, I'm going to start off by showing you a film, a short film, which was actually put together by the Cultural Intelligence Center. It's actually old now, it's probably a bit dated. It was put about 5-6 years ago, and some of those numbers have dramatically increased. But I think what it will do is give you a sense of the genesis of cultural intelligence and where that started from. Let's roll the film. Okay, so someone's asked me, how I got into this, and if we've got enough time at the end, I'll tell you a bit more about this. But let's really look at what cultural intelligence is, and this started because around 20 odd years ago, some researchers, who many of whom are still part of the Cultural Intelligence Center today, were asking this particular research question. And they were looking at it from the globalization agenda. So looking at how organizations were beginning to have to work across geographical boundaries. You had some of those huge ones you saw in that video, like Coca-Cola, who would have had, a branch in Nigeria, which is where I'm from. They would have had one in Taiwan and all over the world. And managers, often based in the West, were having to learn how to work across all of those boundaries, work with people who had different cultural values from themselves. And the question they were asking was, what is the difference between those individuals and organizations that were being effective, even as of then, in working across that sort of multicultural, globalized world, and those who weren't doing it properly. And there were obviously some who were doing it well, and obviously others who were failing. Now, although that question was asked a few years ago, I think it's incredibly relevant to us today because, as you can imagine, the world is growing smaller. We're now communicating, especially because of the pandemic, virtually, which means we could have meetings with people all over the world at different times. And what's important is understanding how culture plays a part in the way that we all communicate. Now, what the researchers identified was that there were a core set of capabilities that those people who were doing it well, and indeed some of the organizations who were doing it well, seemed to have. And they defined cultural intelligence, and can I have the next slide, please? They defined cultural intelligence in the following way. The cultural intelligence is the capability to function and relate effectively in culturally diverse situations and contexts. Now, I want to just stop and pause on some of those words. It's about capabilities. And this is where I got excited about cultural intelligence because it kind of drew the line between what we'd gotten used to when we talked about culture, about a kind of awareness, a nice soft, well, let's all be aware that there are other cultures in the world, or sensitivity, all of these things which are incredibly important. So let's be more sensitive to other cultures. But when we talk about CQ, we're talking about the capability. So how do you do this well? What are the skills that you need? And that was exciting because I felt that opened up a whole new dialogue about what we needed to work more effectively with each other and with difference. And it's about how we function and how we relate. And you could say, given the title of today's topic, that it's about how you engage and how we relate effectively in culturally diverse situations and contexts. Now, I want to also pause on the situations and context because the other exciting thing about cultural intelligence, it's not just about how we relate to each other. It's also about situations and context. Now, if you're a leader of any sort, you're constantly coming into contact with different situations, different contexts, whether those are the teams that you lead, the teams that you engage with, the organizations you work with. There are a whole number of contexts that we have to constantly traverse. And this means that we're constantly, that's a lot of constantly being required to cross cultures in the way that we lead and in the way that we engage with others. And that's what makes cultural intelligence so exciting because it's asking the question, how do you do that well? And what are the skills that you need? Next slide, please. So, cultural intelligence, as part of that research, identified these four capabilities. And this diagram in many ways and these four capabilities form the foundation of everything we talk about and do as cultural intelligence practitioners. Your cultural intelligence drive, which looks at your level of interest, your persistence, your confidence during multicultural interactions. Now, I'll give you an example here, and I often use this example because I'm Nigerian, and I'll give you two instances. If you're the kind of person who you from the UK, maybe white British, and you go to Spain, and while you're there on holiday, and isn't it great? We can all start thinking about holidays again. But you go to Spain, you're on holiday, you only have fish and chips, you only hang around in the British pubs, and you hang around with the British people. Alternatively, if you come from Nigeria and you only hang out in South London, shop in Brixton or Peckham, and never go to the West End, never travel out, then if you're either of those two people, you're probably low in CQ drive, which basically means you kind of like to be around people who look like you, talk like you, quack like you. And actually, in your personal life, that's not a bad thing. But if you're required to lead across diverse cultures, if you're required to lead people from different parts of the world, then actually that is problematic. So we like to say that leaders who have high CQ drive are interested in engaging with other cultures, they're persistent, and they're confident about it. And then that leads on to the CQ knowledge, because your CQ knowledge, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that later, really thinks about your understanding about how cultures are similar and different. And this is the part I love best teaching when it comes to cultural intelligence, because it really blows all our minds. Every time I do this, people sit there and go, oh my God, I didn't know that. Because I think we've somehow grown used to seeing culture in a particular way. I'm going to challenge that in a few minutes. And then there's your CQ strategy. Now, your CQ strategy is where you take that persistence, that interest, your knowledge, and then think about what that means in terms of how you engage interculturally. And a lot of people often say to me, well, I didn't know I had to think about that. Why would I think about that? I kind of just do it intuitively. And often this is where we go wrong. Or people say things like, well, I just treat people the way I want to be treated. And that's probably one of the anathemas of cultural intelligence, because how you want to be treated is absolutely connected to your own cultural values, your own cultural preferences, which are nothing to do with the other person. So actually, it's understanding how culture impacts on behavior. And your CQ strategy is where you use that understanding to plan more effectively for multicultural interactions. Remember, CQ is all about getting the job done. And then your CQ action, perhaps the most important of the four, because this is what people see. This is your verbal interaction, your non-verbal interaction, your speech act. All of these things are tied into your CQ action. So these are the four capabilities. And underneath these sit a whole number of different areas. Now, I want to quickly say, before looking at one in particular, a bit more about cultural intelligence and why it's important. Okay, so if I can have the next slide, please. So, what are the defining points of cultural intelligence compared to other approaches? And this is not about knocking any other approaches, because I think there's a significant amount of research now that tells us, what works and what doesn't work. But if you press the first one, and we'll have the boxes come up. So one of the important things about cultural intelligence is that it's developmental. And on the side of this slide, you can see two things, which are CQ reports. And everybody's journey when we work with people starts with a CQ assessment. And I love this because what it does, it's not about determining how unintelligent you are, but actually it gives everybody a baseline. And because you get that baseline, you're able to develop. And there's significant research that tells us that we can all develop our cultural intelligence. And we can work with that as leaders. So you, as a female leader, can think about how you can develop your cultural intelligence to help you engage more effectively. I like the fact that it's based on a very clearly defined framework. Okay, so that means that this isn't just one of those lovely, soft, fluffy things that everybody teaches. This is based on solid academic research. And if you're a bit of a research junkie, then there's loads of peer research out there that you can study and some really great books on cultural intelligence. It's academically validated. And, the Cultural Intelligence Center, led by Professor David Livermore, continue to lead exciting research in this area. Now, here's the one that might interest you. It's predictive. So we know from research that your level of cultural intelligence will predict a number of things. If I can have the next slide, please. It'll predict, for instance, your personal adjustment and adaptability when working across cultures. And this is exciting because if you're a bit like me and, sometimes stepping out of your comfort zone can make you feel a bit nervous or give you it means you take time to adjust. I often think about when I joined the senior civil service. I'd come from the voluntary sector. It felt like walking into a different world. And that took time to adjust. And I often wish I'd known a bit more about cultural intelligence then. It will impact on your judgment and your decision making. So, especially when you're looking at the inclusion agenda, how culturally intelligent you are will often shape how you make judgments, how you make decisions. Because again, one of the things that cultural intelligence helps you do is it helps you with your perspective taking. It helps you understand how culture will influence the people that you're working with or engage with. So you're not just taking decisions from your perspective. And the other one I want to touch on is leadership effectiveness. So we know that leaders who are more culturally intelligent are more effective in leading across diverse cultures, are more effective at engaging interculturally. And that means that makes you much more effective as a leader. If I can have the next slide, please. Sorry about that. That often happens twice. But if we just click again. Right. So here's a book I would recommend if you're interested in this. Here's a book I'll recommend, and called "Leading with Cultural Intelligence" by David Livermore. And one of the things he says in that book is cultural intelligence helps leaders effectively adapt their leadership strategies when working with individuals from different cultural backgrounds while still accomplishing what they need to get done. And I think that's what's so exciting about this. got some really great questions coming through that I can sort of see from the corner of my eye because I've got another screen here. And don't worry, once I get to the end of this, I'm only going to talk for a while, and then I'm going to try and leave about 20 minutes so I can respond to your questions. Okay, let's move to the next slide. So I talked about the four capabilities, and we don't have time for me to go through these in great detail today. But what I do want to do, because I thought you might find it interesting, is just to talk a bit about cultural intelligence knowledge, and that's your CQ knowledge, and what that actually means in terms of how you engage with people, because that's what this particular breakout room is about. So this really focuses on the fact that actually when it comes to CQ knowledge, it's your understanding. How much do you understand about how cultures are similar and different, and how that actually shapes, impacts on you as an individual in terms of your own culture, but also on the way that other people behave, what their expectations are, what their reactions are to the way you lead them or the way that you engage with them. So let's think about what that means in a bit more detail. But before I do that, I'd like to ask you a question, and I'm going to ask you to use the chat function to respond to this question, if that's okay. So if I asked you in 3 words, just 3 words, I mean, if you want to write 3 sentences, I'm going to go do this really quickly, to define your personal culture. So not what you think culture is, but what's your how would you define your personal culture? So I'm going to ask you, if you can, to just put something in the chat function that you would use. And I'd love to see what you put down in terms of how you define your culture. I'm going to give you a few minutes and read off the chat function and see what people are thinking. So what's your personal culture? And remember, I'm not asking how you define culture, but how you would actually define your personal culture. Okay, so have I got any? Let's see. Okay. Okay, wonderful. Values, beliefs, customs. Thank you so much, everyone who's writing. Acceptance, trust, respect. Western liberal Christian. Okay. Encouraging. I like that. Be great to get some more. Um, Millennial, British and liberal. Inclusivity, empowering, respect. Family humor and ethics. Right. Got some really great ones there. Now, I don't know if you can see the chat. You probably can't. But one of the things that always excites me and slightly amuses me when I ask people in a masterclass to do this exercise is how differently we all define culture. So I'll quickly read out some of the others to you. We've got accepting, inquisitive, respectful, hardworking, liberal, loyalty, respect, individualism, liberal, kind, family, fun loving, accepting, honest. Now, just to pause and think about it, with some of the things I've read out, when you think about other people's culture or when you use the word culture, are those the kind of things you're thinking about? So are we thinking about things like encouraging, developing respect? Or are we thinking about things like African, strong, elaborate, Irish, Scottish? Do we define culture by the way people look? Or do we define culture by the way people act or the way they behave? And when we define our own culture, are we using the same measurement that we use for other people? And I think that's really important, that in understanding cultural intelligence, we start with understanding what culture means to us and also what it potentially means to other people. Now, there are lots of definitions of culture. I particularly like to use this one by Dr. Wade Nobles because I think it really captures it for me. And he defines culture as a human process representing the vast structure of behaviors, ideas, attitudes, values, habits, beliefs, customs, language, ritual, ceremonies. And what's important is that bit I've highlighted in purple, which provides them with a general design for living and patterns for interpreting reality. So what you think of as being important to you defines your reality and defines the way that you live your life. Now, if we look at this definition, then we begin to see culture in a whole range of different places. Often, when I'm doing this in a class, I ask people if they belong to a football team. Because actually, the fans of each football team, whether they're Millwall or Manchester United or Everton, will have a culture. Okay. And then if you take that down to your organization, you'll begin to think about the fact that in your organization, there will be teams and departments who have a culture. And actually, within the civil service, there's a culture around banding. And so, whether you're grade seven or you're a grade three, their cultures there, practices, languages, customs, belief. So, there's culture all around us. And that often impacts, and how we relate to that culture will often impact how we engage with the world, but also where our biases lie, where our blind spots lie, and who we're more likely to feel aligned to. So, thank you very much to all of you. And yeah, there's somebody's written on here. We all responded with positive things. I wonder if we asked to define a culture that's not ours, whether people would use a negative word. And that's exactly the point I'm making. That's a really powerful point, because I do think when we talk about other people's culture, we have some interesting stereotypes in our mind when we use that word that we don't apply to ourselves. And this often is underpins how we include or exclude people, because what culture does is creates the in and out groups. It creates the way we define people. So one of the things I was fascinated by when I joined the civil service, the senior civil service, I was there for 3 years, was when you talked about someone, people would often say to you, yeah, what grade are they? And in the health service, it can be, what band are they? And for me, that was a whole new way of thinking about people and defining them by what grade they were at work. So culture is incredibly powerful. And the reason it's powerful is set out in our next slide in a really great journal, who say that culture subconsciously guides our behavior and thoughts, and often influences our sense of belonging, our motivation, our effectiveness at work. So understanding that, having that awareness and knowledge of different cultures, can help you as a leader interact more effectively, and also understand why you respond or react to certain situations in the way that you do. And that's what I'm going to touch on in the next few minutes. But it's also about the way you lead, because if you remember, what I said was a culture helps you understand your blind spots. It helps you understand your biases, understanding the things that shape you and the way you interpret your reality. And that crosses a whole spectrum of things that we're not going to have time to talk about today, whether it's understanding where your privileges lie across the spectrum and why that might, how that influences the way you think about things, understanding the places you're more likely to gravitate to and the places you're more likely to gravitate away from, understanding the in and out groups and how that includes or excludes people within your workspace. And all of those things come with enhancing your CQ knowledge. It also makes you a much more inclusive leader, because one of the definitions I like around inclusive leadership is the one that comes up next, which is by the Employers Network for Inclusion, Equality and Inclusion. Can I have the next slide, please? Yep, that one. And it talks about inclusive leaders being leaders who are aware of their own biases and preferences, actively seek out and consider those different views and perspectives in order to inform better decision making. And as you might recall, that I said earlier on, that one of the things that your level of CQ is about is tells us is predicts, sorry, is your decision making and your judgments and the way you make that. But I want to briefly, in the time we've got, just look a bit in a bit more detail at CQ knowledge. So if I can have the next slide, please. So we define cultural intelligence knowledge, that knowledge about how cultures are similar and different, and that the fact that it allows you to engage in perspective taking. So, as a leader, the more you understand the cultures around you, the more you understand the people who are around you, the better you will become at taking perspective, at thinking about, at being able to put yourself in and view issues from a broad range of different perspectives. And that means you move away from trying to treat people the same to recognizing how you need to shape, interact, and adapt your behavior in order to lead more effectively. Okay, thank you. So I want to look briefly at something we call cultural value dimensions. It's a huge area of CQ, and it looks very much at is one of the helpful ways of understanding cultural differences. And when we look at that, if I can have the next slide, when we look at cultural values, we look at 10 in particular. So we look at individualism and collectivism. We look at high power distance, low power distance, uncertainty avoidance, cooperative and competitive, short term, long term, low context, high context, being, doing, neutral, expressive. I could go on for a whole afternoon about this, but I only have 20 minutes. So, what I'm going to do is actually very briefly look at two, which I think might be quite relevant to today. So, the first one is individualism and collectivism. Now, this really looks at the difference between cultures that are more focused on the rights of the individual and other cultures that are more focused on the group relationship. So if you look at those two pictures of children, what you've got on one side is a child who's playing on his own, and many Western countries are seen very much as the more individualist. And can I just say, this builds on the work done by somebody called Hofstede, who initially looked at some of these cultural value dimensions, lots of information on it in the internet. And the Cultural Intelligence Center has expanded this. So we know, for instance, that in more individualist cultures, like in the West, people are taught to think in terms of themselves as an I. And again, we're not generalizing here. And often it means that people are more comfortable with the concepts of what their individual achievements are, as opposed to in more collectivist cultures, whether those be geographical or indeed professional, the focus is more on the group. Now, there's a lot I can say about this, but what I will say is this. If you've grown up in a more individualist culture, wherever that might be professionally, then you're more likely to feel comfortable saying things like, I want, I did. Indeed, in many individualist cultures, again, without generalizing, a young person might go to their parents and say, you know what, I want to go to university and study ancient Greek. And their parents might say, right, if that's something that you're really interested in, please go ahead. Now, in a more collectivist cultures, a lot of the Asian, a lot of the Arab, sub-Saharan Africa, child will go to their parents and say the same thing, and their parents would say, well, how's that going to feed your family in future? So the actions of the individual are often seen in relation to the group. Now, this brings up some really interesting dynamics, particularly for us as women. And again, that's not something I can go into in too much detail. But think about it when you go for interviews. Are you more comfortable using the word I did, I led, I created? Or are you one who's more likely to use the word we? Have you ever attended an interview and had the feedback, yeah, you know what, I didn't get a sense of what you did? Because often in more individualist cultures, we're recruiting for more individualists than collectivists. And we also, rather unfortunately, I think, identify success and achievement more with people who are more comfortable operating with from an individualist perspective than we do from those who are more comfortable operating within a collectivist perspective. And we can often see people on the extreme as that, as being groupthink, not able to show initiative or take the lead on things. And that's something to think about. Where do you sit in relation to that? Now, the other one I'm going to go through really quickly is power distance. Again, this is a fascinating one. And, I'm literally giving you the sort of tip of the iceberg with all of this just because we haven't got that much time. But power distance really relates to authority and the way we relate to authority. And I think there's some really interesting dynamics here. Now, if you grow up in a high power distance culture, like I did, and I can see I've got some fellow Nigerians on here who just said, give a shout out. Here's a shout out. If you grow up in a high power distance culture, then even socially, I had a father who, when he said jump, I would jump instantly and hope it was high enough, right? Now, I've raised my daughter. I have a 24-year-old daughter who's born and bred in this country, and I've raised her here. And if I was to ask her to jump, there might be some significant debates, discussions about my parenting style, which probably would not end up in my favor because she's very aware that actually that whole sort of you tell me to jump and I jump doesn't quite work. I've got my rights and I've got my responsibilities. Now, that's really interesting. But on a serious note, this really does have a huge impact on how we relate to authority and what that means. And there's a lot of work around this. But let's look at a chart that pulls out some of those things within a work context. And again, this wasn't drawn for the UK market, but is actually, I think this was done by Hofstede, but it does help us to understand this a bit. So if I can have the next slide, please. So look at this. So and that's Gerhard Hofstede, and he initially sort of formulated this around power distance. And it looks as in low power distance cultures, there's a minimalization of inequalities between people. And bear in mind, this is not just about geographical cultures, but this can happen in workplaces. So in certain workplaces, hierarchy is really established. In high power distance cultures, you've got that inequality hierarchy accepted between people. I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm just going to pull out a few of them. So look at the fourth one down. So in low power distance cultures, people expect to be consulted and people expect initiatives from employees. So, it doesn't matter what level you are within an organization, you should show initiative and put your ideas forward. Now, if you're working in a very high power distance culture, you're actually you expect to be told what to do. And the expectation is that the boss will take all the initiative. So in many African, Asian, Arab cultures, the person at the top of the food chain takes all the decisions, and there isn't an expectation that you would make decisions, right? And then there's the formal interaction and the less formal interaction. Now, where does this cut into the way that we behave? If you've come from a high power distance culture, and that might be geographically, you're more likely to expect that you will be told what to do by the people who are above you. Whereas if you're from a low power distance culture, you'll expect that actually you'll have your voice. Now, the danger is, though, is that if you're then working in a low power distance culture, people might say the fact that you're waiting to be told what to do makes you lazy, lacking initiative, unable to make decisions, not really leadership material, right? And you'll also find, and this I think has been a real issue within the health sector over the COVID period, is that people from more high power distance cultures are more likely to do what they're told, even if they don't agree with it, because you were brought up in a culture, which is the one I was brought up in, where you don't argue with the people who are above you. You do what you're told, even if what you're being told to do is potentially unsafe. And think about that one. You're more likely, if you're from a high power distance culture, to find engaging with people in authority quite challenging, quite difficult. Okay, and that can really impact on your promotion chances, your progression chances, because speaking up will not come naturally to you. Whereas people from a low power distance culture might find that much easier to do. And of course, that can also flow out in terms of status. Like I said, there's not enough time to go into this in too much detail. But the question, and if I can have the next slide, the question I think it's important as a leader that you ask yourself, irrespective of where you come from, is how could your awareness and understanding of even these two cultural dimensions impact on the way that you communicate, the way that you engage with others as a female leader, but also the way that you include people. Have you got someone in your team who you've always thought, God, I always have to tell them what to do? It's like I have to spoon feed them. But actually, someone from a high power distance culture is no less capable and no less effective than anyone from a low power distance culture. They may just need more clarity from you as a leader about what it is that you want them to do. Are you someone who comes from a high power distance culture, has dealing with authority, attending interviews, speaking up for yourself being a challenge? How can you begin to change that in the way that you engage and recognize that that is a cultural influence, so that actually you can develop that, you can change that, you can adapt your style, understanding where that actually comes from? Now, I've got 23 seconds left until the question time, because I've got loads of questions on there and I really want to get to answer some of them. But the key message I'd like to take you, and if I have two slides forward right to the leading with culture, is this. The cultural intelligence, and I would suggest, go and do some reading about it. We're working with a wide range of organizations. Maybe I'll come across you at one of those. But what is effective and what's important to understand is that understanding cultural intelligence can help you adapt your leadership strategies when working with individuals from different cultural backgrounds while still accomplishing what you need to get done. It will help you be more aware of your blind spots, your biases, your preferences. But I think the powerful thing about it, and the thing that's made a huge difference for me, is whether it's parenting a millennial who's a different culture from me, whether it's engaging with different organizations, whether it's engaging with different people I come across every day. What cultural intelligence helps me to do is to communicate more effectively, to be more intuitive, more compassionate, more inclusive in my communication, because it helps me to understand the things that I don't know. So that's the end slide. You've got there our sort of our social media contacts if you want to know more about this. But we say do difference differently. And we say intent inclusion has always got to be intentional. And it's all about us being intentionally inclusive. So we're not unintentionally exclusive. So I'm going to get over now to some of the questions that you've asked and try and answer them in the 20 minutes that we've got. So if you see me looking to this side, it's because I've got a computer here. So let's see. Wow. Okay. So I've got one that's got 16 votes. So do you feel that a difference between a national culture and an organizational culture might impact on how successful an organization can recruit staff? I'm thinking about the Ministry of Defense in particular, masculine, centralized, power distance, hierarchical. Absolutely. I do think that. I think that one of the reasons that we don't get as much diversity as we want, particularly at the top of organizations, is because there isn't that understanding about culture. And so often what we're doing is we are setting parameters and boundaries for recruitment that are based on a very particular perspective. So I'll give you a good example that I came across recently. So one of the things we talk about is a lack of BAME leadership at the top of the public sector. I think the percentages are somewhere around 7% or lower. And yet, when I looked across practically every advert for a chief executive in various parts of the public sector, the one thing it said in different degrees of language is you need to have chief executive experience. Now, if the culture of the public sector at the moment is only 7% of the people from BAME communities are leaders, what pool are we fishing from? And these are the sort of things that being more culturally intelligent and understanding our biases, our preferences help us begin to answer. So yes, the answer to that question is yeah, I absolutely think that. And that's why I'm absolutely passionate about getting cultural intelligence into every organization. So do come and talk to us. Power distance point is so interesting, something I've never considered before. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I have to say, I didn't consider it before I found out about cultural intelligence, didn't quite understand what it meant for me personally. And I think that, because we are talking about women in leadership, what really struck me about it was beginning to understand why I had responded to authority in the way that I did, why sometimes I wouldn't speak up for myself. And I was grown up, I was brought up in a place where you were told children are meant to be seen and not heard. And so moving away from that into a place where, we're expected to speak up. And often in our organizations, we say to people, well, if something's wrong, speak up. That's great if you've grown up in a culture where you've been encouraged to do that from childhood, and I've taught my child to do that. But if you've been told speaking up is a negative thing, then actually you're not going to speak up. And so yeah, I think we need to be much more culturally intelligent in the way that we engage with people, in the way we hear from people, and the way we interact with them. Okay. How do you gain a company's genuine engagement and not just a box ticking exercise? Yeah, now that is an interesting question. See, I said at the beginning, I'm all about the leadership and leadership because leaders define culture. So, one of the things that really used to annoy me about things like unconscious bias is all we were doing was saying to people, you're unconsciously biased, so can you just try and consciously not be unconsciously biased, which I thought was a bit of a waste of time. I mean, unconscious bias has its place, and we talk about how you use cultural intelligence to mitigate your unconscious bias. But when I work with organizations, I'm very clear about the fact that we start with the leaders. And actually, I will not work with organizations who will not let me work with their board first, because I just think if we are going to change culture in organizations, then the people right at the top have got to get it. And then we think about how that translates for people at the different levels within the organization. We're also very clear about the fact that this is a journey. It's not a one-off exercise. So I don't like being seen as a training organization, because I think we've kind of done training. We've kind of done training when it's come to inclusion, diversity, cultural awareness, cultural competency, you name it. And one-off training events don't change behavior in organizations. So when we work with organizations, we're asking them to take a journey with us, which is going to consist of a number of different elements to help them become more culturally intelligent, to help their leaders become more inclusive and culturally intelligent. And we only really engage with those organizations who want to take the journey. So that was a bit of a bold stance to take when I was standing up, when I was starting. But actually, I'm incredibly impressed by the organizations who we are working with, and who are recognizing the fact that they don't want to do the one-off tick box exercise anymore. They really do want to think about change in the long term. Okay, let's see. Can you give some insight about into how to assess, understand cultural differences without veering into stereotyping? Yeah, now that is a real danger because, not everybody, I've said I've come from a high power distance culture, but not everybody who comes from Nigeria would have had the same experiences I did. And part of the reason I love the cultural assessment and the way the framework works is that you do have your CQ assessment. Everybody takes one. You're able to do that as a self-assessment or a multi-rater assessment where you get observers to do it. And part of developing your cultural intelligence is really recognizing the difference between stereotyping people and using your cultural intelligence as a way to engage more effectively with people, which means you don't look at people and go, wow, you must be high power distance. But you think, okay, in this situation that I'm finding slightly challenging, what could be going on here? How could culture be playing into this? And how could the cultural values or the preferences of the individuals play into this? But then there's a step forward because you're not just saying that, you're then thinking, okay, what do I need to do? Which is why I love Dr. Livermore's definition. How do I adapt my leadership style, my leadership approach in order to engage more effectively? Okay, interesting within the film, the companies involved were all private sector. Well, yeah, absolutely. There's no the in that film, that's very much about the genesis of CQ, and yes, it did start in the private sector. There's no doubt about that. We don't, Above Difference works mainly with the public sector, only with the public sector. Actually, in addition, we do the third sector, we do education sector, and I suppose those are all public sector and faith based. Yeah, it did. But one of the things I think is a real benefit of it starting in the private sector is that the question started from, really considered, how do we do this in order to get the job done? How do we get better at working with different cultures? And I quite like that because it's moved us away from the kind of fluffy, let's all be aware of other cultures, let's be sensitive, which are great things, to actually what are the skills I need as a leader to engage with the diverse people who I manage, the diverse teams I manage? How do I become more effective? And that's what I like about it. So actually, I think I don't make any apologies for that. I don't work with any of those organizations listed in the film. That was a film made by the Cultural Intelligence Center, but there's been some great work done in the private sector around cultural intelligence. Okay, let's see what else we've got here. Excellent observation. Can I give no, sorry, I just skipped on. Can I give an example of where CQ has been successful? Probably not in the time we've got. There's more examples I'd like to give, but I would say that actually the first organization we worked with, and I don't think they'd mind me saying it, was actually Avon and Somerset Constabulary, and they've been rolling out cultural intelligence now probably for about 2 years, and have now actually got their own facilitators and trainers, and they have now embedded CQ across the organization. All the leaders have been trained. It's changed the way they talk about difference, about culture. They've got a wonderful video online that helps them really think about culture in its wider sense and inclusion in its wider sense. Because one of the things we say is inclusion has to be about everyone, or it's about no one. And they've also incorporated it into the way they promote, the way they recruit. So they're beginning to see more of a follow through in terms of more diversity at the top of the organization. They've really incorporated it in the way they work with communities. Now, they'll be the first to say that they're still getting it right. They're still very much on a journey, but they've really invested in this as a model. And they will talk about a lot of positive things that are beginning to come through because of that. And we've worked now with probably over 1,000 leaders across various parts of the public sector. And the thing that still thrills me, and I was coaching some leaders yesterday, is how cultural intelligence and understanding the power of it, just opens up a whole new spectrum of how they can engage more effectively with their diverse organizations, or indeed increase inclusion and move from what it is and the blame focused agenda to really a much clearer understanding about how they can make a difference. And that's what I get really excited about. Um, okay, 9 minutes. Okay, thank you so much. So I'm from a Pakistani background, and listening to you, I feel like all these points apply to me. Okay, sorry. Oh, that just skipped. Oh, wow. Okay. Sorry about this. My all my questions have just skipped. So let me just find that one again so I can respond to you. Where did that one go? Well, that seems to have disappeared. Apologize. Give me a sec. Do I think that women, okay, sorry, do I think that as women we're more likely to be collectively minded regardless of our culture? Almost like the culture of being female is more collective, and that impacts our progression somewhat. Do you know, that's a question that really fascinates me. Because I'm sure there's some research on it somewhere. I just haven't come across it. But I think that I think it might be a thing. As part of the work I do, like I've said, I've looked at over, we've worked with now over 1,000 leaders, and that number's steadily climbing. We haven't, in terms of looking at people's assessments, we haven't broken that down into, are women more likely to be collective? I think what I can say is that it does feel as if people in the public sector, though, are more likely to be collective. Because I often find that when we look at group reports in teams or boards or leadership teams, people tend to veer more towards the collectivist approach. And so that might be something to do with, the kind of people who want to be part of the public sector and that collective responsibility. I don't know. I'm not basing this on any academic research. But I do think that perhaps it's a question we could ask ourselves. I know I came out quite high on the collective, but then, I come from an African family. I'm an oldest child. I think some of those things do shape the way we see our reality. I don't know. I don't want to sort of start coming out with anything that might be perceived as being sexist, especially when we need to be much wider in our thoughts around gender roles and responsibilities now. But I think it could be a thing. And I think if it's something that, you read more about and you thought that that was a thing for you, the challenge for you is how do you adapt that in certain situations? How do you make sure that when you do go into interviews, for instance, you are not holding back on using the word I when talking about the things that you've done, and taking credit for them and not feeling uncomfortable with that. So I think it's a thing, but I don't know if there's any research to actually back that up. So I'm kind of shying away from it. As a leader, do you create the culture or adapt to the culture? If you notice that your team show different cultures, do you seek to develop your workers? Okay, this one I'm kind of definitive on, okay, because I think there is enough research to tell us that leaders define culture, and it's the reason we do start working with leaders first. One of my favorite quotes, and I can't tell you who it's by now, but you'll find it on the internet. It says, the culture of an organization is defined by the worst behavior the leader will tolerate. So if you're a leader, you lead, you shape, you define the culture. And part of the reason cultural intelligence is so powerful in understanding what that means is that we often define culture by the way we do things around here. But the question is, who's the we? If the we is the majority, And whether that's the majority in terms of color, in terms of professionalism and skills, in terms of people who like football as opposed to people who like rugby, then that becomes a whole in group in itself. And if you don't fit into that, then actually you're never part of that organization's culture. And that's something I think we need to start thinking about a lot more. What does culture mean in our organizations? And what role do leaders have in shaping and defining the culture? And if we take that particular quote as being real, if you're a leader listening to me right now, when it comes to the inclusion agenda, what's the worst behavior that can go on in your team or department? What are you prepared to overlook as a leader? Because whatever you overlook, you're giving out a message that that's okay, that's acceptable. And I think that's wrong. And so I think that's why I'm driven by a passion to, when I engage with organizations, to just say we've got to start at the top, because the moment you have leaders understanding their responsibility and the power they have in shaping the culture, then people start asking a whole range of different questions when it comes to the inclusion agenda. And as I say, it's all about then, the next question I follow with is, how are you being intentionally inclusive? Because we've kind of just assumed that inclusive leadership is one of those wonderful things that should just happen, and it doesn't. John Maxwell says that leadership is intentional. You have to be intentionally inclusive. Okay, uh, 4 minutes to go. So let me see how many more questions I can get through. I'm an interviewer with a professional body, and we always struggle interviewing people for chartership because most people, even in the Western cultures, are inclined to talk about the we, not the I, in their achievements. Absolutely. Now that's an interesting one, and it does again challenge, the question: what is it that you're looking for as an interviewer? And one of the interesting things about cultural value dimensions is that if you come from a low power distance culture, then you're likely to view people from a high power distance culture through a particular lens. As I said, you can say they don't show initiative. The individualism, collectivism is a thing, because you're likely to say, well, someone who uses the word we as opposed to I, they haven't had the track record of leadership that you're looking for. But I think we need to adapt the questions. We need to adapt our interview procedures right from really from our adverts. The language we use in our adverts are based on a particular cultural perspective. Now, I'm not saying we don't need leaders who are, strong in terms of their ability to lead and demonstrate their ability to lead. But what I am saying is that there's ways in which we can assess and judge that without limiting that to people's use of language to describe that. And it's more about, the cultural intelligence and awareness of the interviewers as opposed to the people they're interviewing. And this is what inclusion really has to be about. We have to stop looking at it from such a narrow lens and actually begin to broaden that and think about how we place barriers in people's way. Do you need chief executive experience to be a chief executive? That's an interesting question. But if you haven't got a pool to fish from, then you're forever going to leave that pool without people from certain backgrounds in. How can you look for the experience and skills you need without placing barriers on which assume that there's a whole range of people out there with that level who've been able to do those jobs? And what your cultural intelligence helps you do is understand the barriers that people have faced. Okay, I've got about a minute left, 2 minutes left. We're at the moment navigating through a merger where two departments are now having to refine, agree a single culture. Big challenge. Any, okay, these questions. Any advice on how you tackle this? Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first thing you do is start thinking about what the cultures of the two teams, the two departments are. What's that going to mean? And part of your understanding cultural intelligence and all those cultural value dimensions I spoke about will be thinking, okay, where are we coming at things from? How does culture of the team and some of the individuals in it shape the way we approach things? And how can we compromise and bring together? And what's the culture of the new body going to look like in such a way that you don't have an unevenness in terms of whose culture is defining it? And I think those are some of the things that you can think about. Let me just see. I think that's about it. So I hope taking away from this breakout room, what you have got is a sense of what cultural intelligence is about, how powerful it can be. We do follow us on Twitter It's at Above Difference. And if you want to find out more about cultural intelligence and how, as a leader or in your department, you can use it more effectively, then check us out at abovedifference.com, get in touch with us, or indeed look at the Cultural Intelligence website internationally, and you'll find out much more information about it. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure getting to speak to you, and I hope you found this of value. Thank you, and thank you for all your questions.